I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week, help me welcome Melissa Allison to the Poetry of Predicament. We met originally at the Deep Adaptation Forum, but where I really discovered Melissa Allison's magic is when she started to share the value that she has received from engaging with the WEL Systems work. So help us talk about relationship with Melissa Allison. Hello there, and welcome once again to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And I am your host, Dean Walker. It is December in 2020, the longest year in human history, says my know-nothing expertise, but definitely my experience. And I'm really pleased to include in one of these last interviews of this year a woman I consider a friend, even though we've only met in this kind of setting, these occasional Zoom calls over the past few months, in a couple of different settings. Melissa Allison, we've gotten a chance to talk within the context of the deep adaptation community that we both were involved with to some degree a few months back. I think that's how we might have first connected, I'm pretty sure. And then also through the connection that I'm very pleased to have and really honored to be connected as much as I am with the WEL Systems community, WEL Systems, and I'll put contact information for both the deep adaptation community and the WEL Systems work and so on in the show notes. And Melissa, I would like to just recap a couple of our primary connections and speak that into a bit of an introduction about what I would like this conversation to include today. And that is when we got to talking about the deep adaptation community and what was then very much in formulation, very early days of that work. And I just found you had a refreshingly sober, clear, seemed like a very balanced view of what was going on. There was very little of what I encountered with a lot of folks in the early days of that community, early 2019 and so on, which was a lot of kind of rainbows and unicorns, and this is such a lovely environment, and everything's all positive and sweet, and we're all connected and so on. It had a kind of a new agey feel to it, and also an ungroundedness in many of my conversations with other folks in it for a while. You were a definite exception to that. Not that you or I at that time, I don't think we were particularly like negative about it, but it just seemed like there was a refreshing groundedness of what it was to really be involved with the collapse-aware conversation at a new level. And that to me is always sobering. It does not work for me to go into an airy-fairy kind of let's find solutions together, or it's all about love and it's all about circling together and it will all feel good together. And I'm being a little unfair in my capsulization, but I hope y'all get what I'm pointing to. So that was my first experience of you. And then later on, we connected quite a bit about the WEL Systems work one way or another, and those brief connections were also very inspiring, and same feeling, just drawing the thread out through time, and we both had more experience under our belts in different ways, and that thread continued till just recently, and continues still, with something that you wrote about what appeared to me to be a transformative experience of intimate relationship. And it really rang with much of what I've heard others in the WEL Systems community, all of y'all being women. What I've heard so many of you share is there's this sobriety, there's this aliveness, there's this kind of, well, I think we're going to get to what I'm hoping we're going to get to in today's conversation is what does it mean to have a transformative experience, to have an experience of transformation, meaning something that really shifts in a fundamental way, elements that we consider core and often go unexamined or even unarticulated in our bodies, in our experience for our whole lives. We can be unconscious completely to the dimensions that I think you and I are going to talk about today. And what I was drawn to and what you shared was that you have such an extraordinary ability. I hope you're going to do a whole lot more writing. You have such an ability to articulate some of these inner dynamics and inner distinctions that that I'm pointing to. That you know, I really just wanted to get into deeper conversation with you, and because this is very much the level that my work is involved with, is while I offer folks kind of the beginner's toolkit, if you will, of self-regulation and co-regulation in the face of larger stressors and so on, which we all need, and that's all fine. So does deep adaptation, covered some of that basic ground, really important, good stuff. But I think what you're sharing as you do more writing, and certainly in every one of our conversations, is the next, at least the next level out of deeper engagement and really kind of earning the right to use the word transformative. And I'm saying it that way quite pointedly because I think our culture tends to commodify and normalize words and concepts and distinctions that are not served well by being commodified. So in other words, like when something's transformative, it is not necessarily a pleasant thing. I think there are ways to emphasize or to invite of truly positive, extraordinarily life-altering in a good way experience. But if you'll excuse my language, this is not a place to be fucking around. This is not a place for people who don't have an essential groundedness and some of the spiritual and psycho-spiritual basics really down, cornerstones in place, so that we have a place, a home, an inner core to return to and to refer to, which I know that in the WEL Systems work, y'all have at the center of that work. So thank you so much for sitting through this long introduction. I wanted to give people a sense of why I am asking you to be here and to share your experience of this dimension, this transformative aspect of our world. Because for many people, even if they've done a whole lot of personal growth work or they've read a lot of books and so on, the experience of transformative work is, again, not fucking around. This is not for the faint of heart. This is tough work, and it's tough foundation pieces that need to be put in place. And that means, in my experience, one of my cornerstones is to be able to let go to let go at layer after layer, depth after depth, thinking, okay, this is as low as it's got to go. I don't have to let go anymore. And could be the next moment is the next demand to let go again. So again, my thanks for your patience in sitting through what's probably for a better orator, it would have been a whole lot shorter, but that's my introduction to this zone of transformative work. And my hopefully at least partial introduction of you as really an extraordinary articulator of some of that, mapping out some of that area, some of that zone. And really a pleasure to have you here. It's great. It's been too long since we connected last. So I really appreciate you taking this time and speaking with us. And I'm hoping if you wouldn't mind just starting with any other way that you'd like to be known, that I've given such a really scant introduction of you. And so I'm wondering if you could just start with anything you'd like us to know about you, who you are now, how you are now, how life is, what life is for you, and welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to see you again. It has been too long. Yeah. A lot of what you said resonated for me, and I like the way that you introduced me. In terms of other identities or labels that I would currently enjoy, one is vegan, as I've mentioned before. And I guess, when you talked about my writing, I appreciate what you said. And I use my writing to explore my own internal world, not just to communicate with others. And I put it on my blog also for myself. I'm really gratified when it resonates for people and they want to communicate with me about it. But putting it out there helps me see myself in a way that just journaling doesn't. And similarly with talking to you, Dean, I know that in speaking with you today, I'll learn more about my own internal world. I already have. And that's very valuable to me, especially because I don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about this outside of my circle of friends or people who I happen to meet. So this is nice. I know this is going to a wider audience, and that means something for me inside that will cause me to change.
So at the risk of actually what I would want to do ideally is pick up any of the threads that you laid out for us in that recent blog piece about relationship. If there are particular points from that piece, which of course I'll put the link in the show notes for that, I'm curious if you have any pieces that bubble up, that come to your awareness as we're starting this conversation, that seem like, this would be a good place to start. This really represents some of the transformative steps that I was trying to express in the article. If you have any of those, I'd rather start where it's alive for you. And if nothing's coming up right now, I'm happy to start us out on a track, but I'd really rather go with what's alive for you if you got something going on.
Yeah. So the article, the blog post that you are talking about and that you reached out to me about was the Unsudden Divorce, which was the big transformation that I went through this year. And it includes a divorce, and it includes coming together with my girlfriend, who I'm currently with. Probably the biggest piece of that blog post for me was realizing that I had neglected myself for a number of years, that there was a point when I stopped complaining about things that were important to me and that it turns out needed to change in my relationship, and left myself and my soon-to-be ex-husband with the impression that things were much more all right than they were. And I've been exploring how that happened. It didn't feel like me to me. I'm usually really forthright, even obnoxious when I want something or I think something's missing or needs to change. I'm not, a shrinking violet. And it was surprising to me to realize that that had happened. And so I've done some exploring in that realm. And what I see right now, and this is pertinent, this is interesting. I had a conversation last night with a friend about this on another subject. I think there's a continuum of like ownership. And I think that I went a number of years ago, from maybe 10 years ago, from a state of being that was agitated a lot. I had an anger problem and I was reactive. And all of that came from a deep reservoir of grief and fear. And, that's rooted in really old stuff for me that caused me to behave in ways that made me ashamed. And then the shame would lead to more of that behavior. And it was an ugly cycle. And I recognized it early on, probably when I was about 30, I really started recognizing it, or even in my late 20s. And when, by the way, my first husband killed himself, which was a big catalyst for me to start going into my inner world, because the other choice was basically at that point to die. For me, I was in a really bad spot and I had to go inside to get any kind of peace. So I started realizing these things about myself, and I worked on them for a really long time. And in the course of that time, I got together with my husband of 20 years, my second husband. And, he saw that, and I'm very grateful that he was patient with me around that. He knew I was working on it. And there were times when I think both of us wondered if it would ever improve. At some point it did, I gradually shifted. I came to know myself. I came to love myself. I stopped having so much fear and whatever else was leading to that reactivity. And I started really owning my own behavior and my own feelings. Mm. And I think that in recent years, all of that shifted. I took such ownership of everything that was happening around me that it shifted over to the point where I was no longer willing to complain about things that I should have been complaining about, things that were genuinely bothering me. And I just kept trying to make peace and thinking it's inside me. This is an inside job. I just need to make peace with this. When in fact, one way of making peace with it would have been to walk away, or to complain so much that neither of us would have been able to stand my complaining, and I would have walked away. Something like that would have been more honest. But to try to make peace when I'm not really feeling peace inside about something is I think was for me a form of dying. It was a form of giving up on myself, neglecting myself, and starting to die inside, starting to downregulate to the point of, I don't know, I'm going to say being a reptile, like I got hypothyroidism. I had a bit of skin cancer. I think there were just signs that this identity wasn't working for me, and that I wasn't speaking about things that were important to me. And that's been a real revelation. And I guess one of the big upshots of it is that I can see that there's a middle way to be. That yes, there's owning your reality, and there's, not complaining too much and not being reactive. And then there's becoming a doormat to things you don't want to be a doormat for. And what I'm looking for is the middle way, where I speak my truth with confidence and integrity. And I think that would be better for me and people around me, and would have definitely been better in my marriage.
Yeah. Thank you. Incredible. There's a lot there. I hope you don't mind. I'm gonna kind of overlap things that might be a total mismatch, but for me it was stunning how what you were describing as in an intimate relationship level, it seemed quite similar to something that I think you and I talked about a bit in at the level of organizational, like in the deep adaptation community, where, how did you put it? You said, it seemed like you were saying that you really overdid it in terms of trying to make peace with not just the pieces that were current, that were turbulent, that were creating controversy or creating that friction directly in the relationship, but it sounded like you were actually expanding that, making peace with, out to everything, including to things that didn't call for making peace at all. In fact, it sounded like you were saying you started to sacrifice your voice, that you were no longer naming things that truly were at the center, did need to be addressed, and would not be served by making peace with it. That would be like an overriding of a core message, of a life critical message, because you were talking about some sicknesses and so on that you seemed like they might have something to do with this covering over rather than telling the truth about certain elements. And how I am resonating that with the organizational level with deep adaptation is, I noticed really since day one with the deep adaptation material, is that it implies there's this blanket that seems similarly to try and override or insulate us from naming things that really need to be named in this world on a global scale. And so I'm thinking about the deep adaptation. One of the few things that they've articulated as sort of their charter or the way they operate is there'll be no shame and blame. There'll be no listing of the daily report of the things going wrong on the planet, the doom and gloom report. There'll be none of that. And that even in the deep adaptation circles, the deep listening circles and deep relating, I think it's more open and goes deeper now, but my earlier experiences were that it built itself as an environment in which there was an invitation to fully feel and feel safe in this circle and bring how your heart is breaking or bring whatever you've got. And then the actuality was a different thing. Again, a kind of a unspoken blanket of we want all those emotions, well, except for that one, and not so much of that one. So I hope you don't mind. I was just kind of resonating at a different scale. I don't mean to take away from or diminish where you're going with your thread, but I want to keep kind of doing that because we've talked, you and I, on both levels quite a bit. And this is my first time with you to hear really the intimate relationship level. So I'm very much wanting to get back to your articulation of that and your sharing of that. I just wanted to kind of speak the other one into the conversation as well. So I hope you don't mind.
Oh, of course not. That's fine with me. I think the connection you're drawing is really interesting. And I think that everything I talked about is a metaphor, not just in my life, but in the world. I was describing disconnection, and my opinion, which is just my opinion about what happened or is happening in deep adaptation. I haven't checked it out in a while, but the last time I was in the Facebook group, for example, and even a little bit elsewhere in other formats, I noticed they talked about, like you said, no shame and blame, which I think is a fine goal, but people should still be able to speak about anger from the point of view of their own hearts. This is what I'm experiencing, as long as they're not pointing a finger, I feel, even at themselves, as long as they're just saying, I want to own this, but there's no, beatings going on, verbal beatings going on. And I think, yeah, I mean, what happened was a real lopsidedness. You could see how there was an attempt to create sanctuary, to create safety and openness. And it wasn't safe and open. For example, there were factions, and some factions believed, as I do, that spirituality and getting in touch with our own personal selves is going to be the only way that we can make peace with what's coming, personally or as a group. And I'm trying not to have too much hope for what we might do as a group, but I do think it would be possible, and certainly has been possible in the past, that if everyone were to get in touch with themselves, or some large percentage of us were, there could be big changes in the world. I don't think it would happen through the kind of factions and fighting that we see, even unfortunately in the deep adaptation group. I think the worst attacks were, deleted and talked about so that didn't happen so much. But there was a subtle undercurrent that this spiritual message wasn't very welcome. And there could be real snarkiness and nastiness about it, where people are clearly focused outwardly. They're focused on finding, my opinion is that they're focused on finding a culprit and attacking that culprit. And if they can eradicate it everywhere they see it, including within their own community, they'll be safe or whatever. And that's, I think, quite the opposite of the truth. I think if they were to get in touch with themselves and how they feel when someone like me comes forward and says, this is the way I believe, we could do it. If they could feel what that meant inside of them, any feelings that brought up for them, they'd learn a lot more than they do or did by getting sarcastic or, saying no permaculture is the answer. You're wrong.
Got it. Thank you. Now that I've taken us out on this thread, I'd like to return part of the using the word or focusing on the word transformative or transformation, and particularly in relationship. Part of why I wanted to speak with you and part of the renewed emphasis on this in my work is there's a level of discomfort that we seem to culturally in these privileged countries that we live in, we learn to avoid the discomfort. And sometimes for some of us, that means avoiding the discord or the relational friction that could come from speaking my truth in a given moment in that relationship. And I think what you were describing before is some of the costs that can show up when, if I'm bringing more of my intent to avoiding discomfort for either myself or my partner, and so I go that track, even though there is an ever enlarging mound of costs to going down that track instead of naming and presencing myself with the naming of the truth, the naming of that uncomfortable truth. And that seemed to be at the core of that blog post, was that there would seem to be a pivot point where you realized you had gone further down that comfort at all cost track. And I'm sorry, please put your own words on it. You know, it's just what I'm calling it at the moment. And realizing that no, indeed, the cost is too high. I'm looking back on this and it's like, no, this has gone too far. Even though in the life as usual, business as usual mode, nobody's talking about it. So that's my little brief recap to get us back to kind of the rawness and the very personal nature of your blog post. Can we shift back from the organizational to the personal again? And did anything I just said in my recap of what I interpreted from your writing, did that spark you to share anything?
Yeah, Dean, you've really captured it well. And I appreciate the way you've reminded me of what was in that blog post. I mean, I read it before we spoke today, and still you're getting to a layer that's quite deep. I think it gets at the truth beneath the truth of what goes on, the personal truth beneath the truth of what goes on in any relationship and any conversation for that matter. There's an energy to the way people connect. There's an energy to the way you and I connect right now that we can feel even if we don't name it. And we could probably feel it on many levels. And who knows how many we could explore if we chose to. But that's what I'm interested in my personal life. And that's what, yes, exactly what I got to in my 20-year relationship was realizing that the truth beneath the everyday truth, which had many beautiful elements to it, what I still consider a friendship. There was a truth beneath all of that I had ignored, in not in favor of comfort, yes, but also in favor of not wanting to be who I used to be, not wanting to be that reactive person. I think some of the things that I used to say when I was angry and reactive were true. I just think that the way I was bringing them out was damaging. And I think that when I let go of some of that, I let go of all of it, including allowing myself to feel the pain. So that is where I was avoiding discomfort. I was probably doing it, now that you bring this up, thank you, to avoid the pain that it caused me when I saw that. Reacting was sort of a way to avoid that pain also. It was a way to, really quick pull myself into a state of mind where I could act and speak quickly and think quickly and not deal with the pain underneath. And then I shifted to a place where I was much more at peace with my life and the world around me. There was this part I wasn't comfortable with. And instead of learning to proactively bring that up in a direct, honest fashion, I hid from it. I continued to hide from it, just in a quieter place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, it made me sick, I think.
I've noticed it in many, many of the conversations with the WEL Systems women that I've had the opportunity to speak with in these interviews. There are elements that are indeed transformative, because we're not talking about a small deal here. We're talking about life energy that you experience in yourself, in your own body, as a sovereign being. And then we're also talking about one of the most important relationships in a person's life, the intimate relationship that we'll have with that person that we are mated with for some period of time in one fashion or another. And that could be lifelong and often is not. And it's as long as it is. And it's a big chunk of time, oftentimes. You're talking about 20 years. That's no small deal. The stakes are high. So with transformation, the stakes are always high. It's always really close to existential in nature. If it's not literally life being at stake, it is precious core elements of life at stake. And a couple of the pieces that I've noticed in these conversations with y'all, and something I should mention and repeat for the folks who watch this podcast from time to time, you'll know that the reason that I'm having these kind of hyper-focused conversations with people like yourselves who have something to say about, if it's intimate relationships or if it's the level of organizational relationships, which is no small deal for people. Like, if you got to go to work and you're spending more time at work than you are with any other part of your life, that's a big freaking deal. So these elements are no small thing. And now we're actually at a time, I would assert, that we are in the middle of, even in the most privileged environments, the direct experience of human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. So the pressure is going up and up to try and hang on and be present in the face of these huge stressors, which are just getting larger. So I want people to understand why I'm having these conversations like the one we're having, and why I include the WEL Systems work as one of a few different bodies of work that I'm putting into this imaginary toolkit that I certainly use and borrow from for my own practices of reconnection in life. And also I offer these out for others who are participating in this work to choose from, like a menu. They can choose these things as they see, wow, this would be a good fit. I'll try some of this. I'll go find out about this WEL Systems work and so on. So a couple of the pieces that came to mind when you were talking just now. One is that there's, in certain dynamics that keep showing up in my conversations with y'all, there's this conversation about, first, to become, perhaps over time, because it's kind of a new learning for many, or a relearning of how to be internally referent, like where I refer to when I'm looking for my own truth, when I'm looking for my core reality to be able to reflect off of, to have a baseline to discover what's sane and what's insane in the world around me, that sort of thing. So again, high level skill set, but most of us are so completely disconnected from that strong internal reference in our reality that literally we have no choice but to become the polarized, wildly disconnected culture that certainly the USA is probably the most chaotic example of that in the privileged countries of the world. This is a big deal. So I'm hearing you sharing indirectly some of your return to that internal reference for your truth and your reality, and that you're choosing out of that. You're referring to that for your next choice and your next choice. So I see you nodding, and I'm going to be quiet in just a moment and let you just take a thread, whichever one you like, and run. I also want to mention that I keep hearing and experiencing that this shows up, this internally referent reality, how it shows up for me over here. when I get the pleasure of being in conversation with you, or in a relationship moment where we get to connect, there's a quality of presence that is extraordinarily different than when I'm speaking with someone who is externally reverent, who's disconnected from that core. So I just wanted to speak those things. And I'm curious, in my mentioning of those, are you sparked to say anything about that?
Oh, absolutely. That's the heart of it. And there's so many things to say about being internally referenced, and about being present. I think a lot of traditions value this and point to this and say that this is the way toward peace and happiness and, a meaningful life. And, there are a lot of paths to take. For a long time, I did Buddhism and silent retreats, and I found those to be very helpful in recognizing how much of the noise that goes on inside of me is coming from inside of me and not outside. If you're silent for a week and you're, at a Buddhist monastery where people can't even look you in the eye or smile at you, any story you tell yourself is coming from inside of you. There's no getting around that, and you have to deal with it. And this work with WEL Systems is a lot like that, but it adds the element of being in connection with other people. So we create, and what I try to create in my life and other conversations outside of the experiences that I go in person, and now during COVID online, to have these hugely transformational experiences. They're all about having a sanctuary, a safe place where I can, the way I think of it is, see myself and know the truth of myself, whatever that might be, no matter how loud and joyful, no matter how sad, no matter how embarrassed or afraid or whatever I might label it, to just be myself in this safe place and see other people holding reverential, sacred space for me that has no judgment in it. It's like another level beyond what the silent retreats were for me, another level of seeing myself through the connection, and then hearing them speak their truth and knowing that we're all the same. We're all connected. We're all literally the same. It's just a way to get in touch with that on a profound level that isn't possible in most of our culture. Mm-hmm. I think it's everything. It's what living means and what living is. And anytime anything is getting in the way of that inside of me, I want to get back to that place so that I can be living again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sweet. Thank you. I have as I mentioned, a number of different bodies of work in that imaginary toolkit that I keep talking about. And one of the other ones in it has a distinction called liquid state. And it resonates a lot with me for a number of different reasons. A number of different lineages have something along the lines of a dynamic of shifting from, often when I'm externally referent, as we're talking about right now, I'm reactive to the things around me, and I'm sourcing my choices out of that reactivity. It's a constant kind of like this feeling energetically going through the world and bouncing off of those external references for choice. And what that often shows up like inside of me is whatever I can hold rigidly in place, I can start to call that certainty. And I start to crave certainty, try to make everything around me certain. And what that also means is rigid or non-moving. And I think you and I can both nod at the ridiculousness of my thinking that that's a good way to be. But my experience of the vast majority of our culture is that that's what we crave, whether it's at the business level, the relationship level, whatever I can hold in place firm and not have to worry about, well, how is that going to change? How's that going to, I don't want that to change because then it's out of control and I've got to put attention on it and that's a pain in the ass and so on. So this liquid state is what one way of relatively gracefully creating a bridge from that rigidity and that illusion of certainty and deifying that. It allows me to create a bridge to something so alive, so moving in its natural way in my system. What I hear you describing as you refer, you have that internal referencing for your reality on a moment by moment basis. There's very little in life that is more fluid than that. And there's an obvious natural flow to that. But I don't get to see that natural flow. I don't get to see the innate power and truth of that. I get to fear it. I get to fear it if I'm holding on over here. So the liquid state I'm talking about is the transition that would allow me to loosen my grip on trying to keep everything held so tightly, and then allow a transition to where I can start to experience volitionally, consciously, at least moments at a time of maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe this is actually something that's vibrantly alive that I've been keeping away, fearing it so deeply. So this liquid state is a way to go from that fear-based holding to a direct experience of the level of aliveness and the kind of the essential truth available moment to moment that you could be referring to. So I wanted to mention that as a transition, like how does a person learn to do this? How does a person, go from this intense investment in holding it all together, and that's the way we're supposed to do life, to this incredibly empowered, but very, very different way of making life choices moment by moment. So again, thanks for sitting through what was kind of a long lead up. I'm curious if that sparks you to say anything about that, especially about that transition. Is there anything you could share about your own?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That was beautiful the way you described that. And I like that you call it a liquid state. I've been doing some snorkeling recently, and I used to consider those moments when I stepped away from the gripping, the holding on to things, not wanting them to change, the fear that meant for me. I used to feel like I was falling. The more I would strip that away, I would feel like I was just falling through space, and that falling was scary at first, and then a really natural, beautiful place to be without any fetters, just being. And snorkeling lately, especially if I can find a place in the ocean that has no floor, I can't see the coral beneath me anymore, is like that. And it's a liquid state. It's so beautiful. In terms of getting there are so many paths, right? I mean, Buddhism is one. Your toolkit has many, I know. And the reason I think that this worked for me was the safe space that it created for me to look inside, to know that whatever is there is going to be okay. and this is the way any path I've taken a few over my life, has worked. And I found this one to be the most profound for me, for where I am now. It enables me to look inside myself and know that whatever fear is coming up when I have a trigger, for example, is not as big as it feels inside of me. That if I address that, if I breathe with that, I will not only survive, but thrive and have a more joyful existence on the other side. Whereas if I try to grip it and hold it and keep it in place, whatever I'm doing to avoid it, it's going to be a lot more painful, not in the end, but in that moment. I mean, I think people think, oh yeah, in the end, if I let this go, I won't let it go forever. And then they do. But really, it's in that moment that you're going to get freedom if you address it. It's a matter of having the courage to address things right in the moment. And yeah, there's a whole framework, as you know, with the WEL Systems for building our capacity for that, and for supporting each other in that, and learning to support ourselves as we experience it. Another big part of it is not waiting until it bites you in the ass to do something about it, not waiting for the trigger, but constantly surveying our inner landscapes so that we know who we are in every single moment. And we know where the ripples are and what size they tend to be. And if it gets a little bigger, we see that before it becomes a full-blown, freaking out catastrophe that we have to breathe through. Just breathing all the time is a really good idea. And looking inside all the time is a great practice and way of having presence and joy.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'd like to just pause in this space that you're talking about right now. You talked about becoming sensitive enough, perceptive enough to be able to pick up on some subtler cues rather than waiting till the thing is stomping on your ass, whatever it is. And so I'm curious, can you share some of how you've developed some acuity, how you've refined some of those sensitivities, maybe some examples, whatever you're comfortable with. This year I'm really wanting to emphasize what are some of the tools, the methods, the ways that sincere practitioners of various bodies of work, the way that they literally have put some of these things into motion in their lives daily, so that there's more aliveness, there is more accurate awareness and perception of the world around us and within us. All of this while the world is going further and further crazy and whipping itself into a froth at a higher and higher level on a daily basis. I mean, it's literally insane. And what I'm standing for is that there's an option within that escalating froth, that there's a way for us to be in the middle of it, expanding our level of aliveness, expanding our capacity to be present, like remarkably present in the face of those escalating stressors. I think you've been describing that zone. I'm wondering if you could share any part of that process for yourself of becoming more aware, more sensitive to those subtler cues. Where are you looking? What are you looking for? What are you noticing? When do you get a sense, like, how does it show up when from time to time you miss some cues and it comes like bang, hits a little harder than you'd like? Anything that you'd like to share about that? Because this is like, if we were talking about martial arts, this would be like you sharing what it's like to get out on the mat and practice. And I want people to get a sense of that so that they can see, oh, there are alternatives to just cowering in fear or despair about this frothy, crazy world going on. There's actually practices I can put in place on a daily basis. So, anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that. The story that comes to mind recently that I think might describe what this is like in real time is one that involves where I'm living with my girlfriend right now, which is in a rainforest where it's very hard to get our clothes dry. We don't have a dryer. We're living with solar power and there's not a dryer. So we watch for the sun breaks so that we can get the clothes out to dry. And sometimes a shower or even a downpour will come and we have to run out and get the clothes and bring them back in and then watch for the next sun. And, so we're not living walking around in moldy clothes all the time. So we were doing that the other day, and I had been keeping an eye on my running shoes. I'd been very protective of them. Hers were already wet. They'd gotten wet in another downpour, but mine had survived while my sandals had gotten wet. So I'd given up on my sandals, but I was preserving my one pair of dry-ish shoes for my running shoes, and they were left out. And I walked up on the roof where we put these things, and I walked up there and saw that my running shoes had been just soaked. And I was like, no, inside me, I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? This is just the worst. I don't have one pair of dry shoes. I was way more upset than I wanted to admit to myself. And that's the problem. As soon as I felt that, oh no, I really needed to pause and deal with that. And it seemed so small. It just seemed like I would be a baby to be worried about that. And so whatever little story I told myself, this is no big deal, I can handle this, whatever. I just continued on my way. I gathered up all the shoes and I brought them downstairs. And I didn't know that I still had this thing I hadn't dealt with. And so what happens is, and what happened to me was, I leaked some of it. So I wanted to say something because I thought she was the one who had left them up there. Although honestly, we'd both left them up there. We could have both seen it raining, but I didn't think I knew my shoes were up there and whatever. I wanted to say something about this. And I ended up saying it with an edge. I think I said something like, I know you've given up on your running shoes, but I haven't given up on mine. And it was like the energy of it, we could both feel. It was like, oh, like, what is going on here? There's too much blame in that. What is going on? And so my second opportunity was to recognize that and own it, to say, oh my goodness, I was way more upset about this than I realized I was. And, I'm sorry, first of all, and I've got something I've got to deal with here. It's a real fascination with what's going on inside me that allows me to go there, and enough experience of doing this that I no longer feel afraid to do it or ashamed. Like that's probably what the trigger was, but it's not so big that I can't face it and be honest about it and open about it and, create some connection, some authentic connection, and it gets even more complicated if there gets to be a double trigger. If I say something like that and I still don't own it and it upsets someone else, and then I became upset that I upset them, like the triggers can be like a spiral. And I think people do this all the time. I know I used to. And at some point, it's just important to have the courage to look inside and own my own part of it. And it can seem really impossible sometimes. And then as soon as I do it, I'm free.
Yes. Beautiful, beautiful, clear, simple, daily life example. Yes. Thank you. And I want to also appreciate, you kind of pointed in the direction of being able to kind of expand it out, how it can start to spiral and expand and spiral and expand. And at the risk of, having it perhaps be a bit too much, I would like to assert that that is a pretty damn apt description of where the USA is on a national scale. That from the most intimate daily small examples by the tens of millions over decades, fueled by other influences that is a whole nother conversation, but that spiral and that expansion, spiral and expansion that shows no sign of pausing virtually anywhere. The kind of healthy pause that you're just showing us an example of wait a second, let's pause together. There's some big flags here that those of us who have this acuity, we can see these flags as long as we take the pause moment to see them, because they're covered by smoke screen right at the moment. But as soon the smoke dissipates, you see it, you then can do what you know to do to return yourselves to that centered space. It's a whole different number of conversations to take it to the national level, but I couldn't help but notice how directly visible your simple intimate relationship example was to draw it out to the national scale. We've literally become a nation that is so unwilling to pause and be self-exploratory, to create more and more self-knowledge and a willingness to open vulnerably with one another the way you were just describing, that we're at the level of our president inciting violence against his own people, and then huge factions by the millions being willing to be violent with one another or see very bad results occur to themselves and to millions of other people in our own country. So I think we're not kidding around is really my point here. The stakes are, again, extraordinarily high. And I don't think there's anything small or even remotely trivial about the example you gave. Pair of freaking running shoes, come on, really. But every piece of the dynamic you described is just as valid a potential solution direction loop, not only for your own relationship, but they take that out to the family or to the neighborhood or to the region or the city or the nation. It is no less valid a loop to explore at any of those levels. So I just, I tend to go a little too far with the examples sometimes. So thanks for bearing with that. I really appreciate it. It was crystal clear, your example. Thank you. It looks to me like we're kind of getting toward the end of the closing of this envelope of this conversation. And I'm curious if you look out through the lens that you described earlier of the value that you create out of sharing in a more public way, like instead of just writing in a journal, writing in a blog, and it's something quite public, and there's a different energy to that, and there's a way of connecting with other people through that expression that will happen here to some degree, where people will watch this and they'll have their reactions and their insights perhaps. And I'm curious, we're talking about a time like no other in human history. And we're talking about some tools, some inner tools, some inner dynamics that really could offer quite a bit of empowerment or freedom or accessing an inner truth that could be extraordinarily valuable to people. And I'm curious if you would like to just wrap this up by sharing any part of your process, any part of your realizations that you've come to in your path and your practices that you could share, particularly with someone who might be a bit new to this. Is there anything that you might like to share in that way?
Yeah, I think that when someone is new, if they're watching the poetry of Predicament, they're going to be curious enough to be wading into it and exploring what's possible. For whatever reason, they've reached a critical moment in their life. They're realizing that collapse is imminent. Whatever it is, they are starting to look inside just by taking that step of looking at this material. And I think the thing that I felt and that I see a lot of people feeling is fear about walking more deeply into it. And I think we all have the courage it takes to get back to ourselves, to find sanctuary inside ourselves. And so we just, in those moments when we're wanting to connect with ourselves, we just need to muster the courage to do it, to keep moving forward and know that there's freedom for us there. And there's no end point. It's not like there's freedom at the end. There's freedom all along the way. It's all these little goodies you get every time you take another step toward yourself. So you'll get rewards as soon as you do it. And don't make the mistake of thinking, I took this step, I feel all this freedom and joy, and that's it. Because like you said earlier in this conversation, it's right when you think you've arrived that the next thing comes up, sometimes because you think you've arrived.
I know, I hate that.
So there's and right. And when that happens, when that happens, instead of being dismayed, oh, that wasn't the end, I hadn't arrived, do what Louise Lebrun always says, which is say, oh, woohoo, here comes my life. This is a fabulous opportunity. It's gone really well every single time I've mustered the courage to step into it. And so I have every reason to believe it will go well this time too. And I'll get more of my life back and be more joyful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That was brilliant. And that seems to be kind of the most homespun place that we could land, where what you were just sharing. And that's to have a circle of friends around us that can remind us in those kind of moments when I've been working real hard on a particular personal insight or a tough part for me to let go, for instance, what I was talking about before. So I'm working, all right, it's time to let go. Okay, good. Oh, God, yeah, but no more. This has got to be the end of the let go lesson. And then 20 minutes later, well, you know. So for me to surround myself with people like yourself who can gently nudge me toward what you were just sharing from Louise of, yeah, it might just be another opportunity to step once again into that flow of growth, of accessing that inner truth, and for us to share relatedness about reminding each other about that, even when we really don't want to hear about it. We'd much rather put up our feet and watch TV for a while or whatever our version of that is. Melissa, it's just been great. This is, I think, the longest I've had a chance to really connect with you. And I so appreciate your writing, so appreciate your obvious commitment to that kind of nudging with yourself, with your own intimate relationship, and with your other relationships in life. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna probably bug you in the not too distant future. That I have a feeling there are other threads that we can pursue in this conversation that would be just as valuable. And that's what this year is about. So Thank you so much for joining me here in this conversation and for doing the good work that you're doing.
I really enjoy these conversations with you. Thank you for inviting me, Dean. I look forward to more.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.